March 3, 1942, Buffalo, New York. The winter wind cut through the open hangars of the Bell aircraft factory, carrying the smell of oil, metal, and hopelessness. Inside, men worked in heavy coats, their breath fogging in the freezing air as they riveted panels to the skeletons of machines no one seemed to want. The concrete floor trembled with the echo of hammer strikes and the whine of air tools. Overhead, fluorescent lights flickered against the polished skins of unfinished fighters, rows of gleaming aluminum bodies waiting for pilots who would never come. It was March 3, 1942. The world was burning. Across the Atlantic, German bombers laid waste to cities, and in the Pacific, the Japanese flag spread like a storm. America was desperate for planes, any planes, to turn the tide. Yet here, in the heart of New York's industrial pride, a brand new American fighter sat abandoned in the corner of the assembly line, already branded a failure before it had even seen battle. Before we go deeper into this forgotten moment of courage, this is WW2 Frontline Legends, where real history meets the bravery that shaped it. If you love stories like this, hit that subscribe button, give this story a like, and tell us where you're watching from around the world. I read every comment, and your hometown might appear in the next legend we uncover. The Bell P-39 Airacobra. Engine mounted behind the cockpit, cannon sticking from the nose like a spear. It was supposed to be revolutionary. But it had become a punchline. Pilots who flew it once refused to fly it again. Engineers who designed it no longer defended it. Test pilots called it the flying coffin. The British had sent theirs back. The French never received theirs. And now, American commanders quietly debated canceling the entire program. The tension inside the factory hung heavier than the smell of paint. Workers whispered rumors that Washington might shut the plant down, that their long shifts and broken backs meant nothing if the military rejected the design. A wrench clattered to the floor, echoing across the cavernous space. A worker named Miller muttered, "We're building tombs with wings." But the line kept moving. Rivets popped, engines mounted, panels sealed. Orders from Washington were clear. Production must continue. Canceling it now would mean shutting down an entire assembly line at the height of war. The country couldn't afford the delay. So the workers built, even as the laughter of test pilots echoed from the far end of the hangar. One of those pilots had just returned from a disastrous flight. His landing gear had jammed. The mid-engine design made the balance unpredictable. When the plane came in too fast, the nose pitched down violently. He barely escaped alive. "I'm not flying that death trap again," he shouted, tossing his helmet into the corner. The echo bounced off the steel beams above. Around him, silence, until another mechanic sighed and said, "Then who will?" The aircraft gleamed under the lamps, beautiful and deadly. On the outside, it looked like a machine born for victory, the promise of a new kind of warfare. Inside, it was a maze of wires, gears, and vibrations that rattled the cockpit like an earthquake. Pilots said it felt like sitting on top of a washing machine mid-spin. The long drive shaft connecting the rear engine to the nose propeller caused tremors so violent that fine aiming became impossible. Every bullet missed its mark. And then there was the fear, the kind that hid in the quiet moments before flight. The engine sat directly behind the pilot's back. When something went wrong, when a piston failed or a bearing broke loose, molten metal and oil would spray forward through the cockpit. In a conventional fighter, an engine fire happened in front of you. Something you could see, something you could fight. In the Airacobra, it happened behind you, unseen until the heat licked your shoulders. Pilots called it betrayal by design. Yet even in that gloom, there was a spark, a handful of engineers who refused to give up. They argued that the concept was sound, that the weight balance, the tricycle landing gear, and the 37mm cannon gave it unmatched firepower. But the Air Force wanted altitude, and this plane choked above 12,000 feet. Against German Messerschmitts and Japanese Zeros, it would be a sitting duck. Still, the war machine had no brakes. Washington ordered thousands more built. Factories in Buffalo ran 3 shifts a day, 7 days a week. By spring, the storage yards outside the plant were full. Rows upon rows of brand-new fighters gleamed beneath the cold sky, engines sealed with wax, cockpits covered with tarps. Machines without purpose. Some called it a national embarrassment. Others whispered that the Airacobra might still find its place, somewhere far away. That was when rumors began to spread through the plant, a secret shipment, an aid package, bound for a country fighting for its life on the other side of the world. They said the Soviets needed everything, tanks, guns, planes. anything that could fly and shoot. And if America couldn't use its worst fighter, maybe someone else could. The plan was simple on paper but treacherous in reality. Crates marked Bell aircraft would be loaded onto ships bound for the Persian Gulf and the Arctic routes. They would travel through U-boat-infested waters, over deserts, and across frozen mountains. Few believed those fragile machines would survive the journey. Even fewer believed anyone would fly them once they arrived. But history has a way of hiding its greatest twists in plain sight. Because far from Buffalo, across the ocean and the snow-covered steppe, there was a pilot who had never heard the jokes, never read the reports, and didn't care what America thought of its own creation. His name was Alexander Pokryshkin, a mechanic turned ace, a soldier with steel nerves and a hunger to defy expectations. He would soon look upon one of these failures and see something no one else did, not a coffin but a weapon. Before we go deeper into this forgotten chapter of World War II, take a second to join the ranks of history lovers who keep these stories alive. Subscribe to WW2 Frontline Legends and tell us in the comments where you're watching from, New York, London, Manila, or Moscow. We read every single one. Because what happens next will prove that sometimes the machine everyone laughs at becomes the one that changes everything. By May 1942, the first shipment of Airacobras left American ports under gray skies, their crates stacked in long rows on the deck of Liberty ships. The sea was cruel that month, waves smashing against steel hulls as sailors prayed the cargo would hold. In one convoy alone, 2 ships were lost to U-boats before reaching Gibraltar. The rest pressed on, carrying hundreds of fighters that no American would ever pilot. Weeks later, the first shipments reached Soviet soil. The crates were unloaded, battered and salt-stained, their contents wrapped in oil-soaked paper and the red dust of the Persian desert. Soviet ground crews opened them cautiously, staring at the unfamiliar design. The manuals were in English. The instruments marked in miles, not kilometers. A mechanic muttered something about capitalist junk. Another crossed himself before touching the fuselage. They had seen British Hurricanes before, clumsy but reliable. They had flown outdated I-16s, and yak ones that barely held together. But this was something else entirely. A cockpit shaped like a car's door, a cannon that could tear through armor, and an engine that, when it started, growled from behind the pilot's seat like a caged animal. No one wanted to fly it. Not yet, until one man stepped forward. Major Alexander Ivanovich Pokryshkin, born in Novosibirsk, trained as a metalworker before joining the Soviet Air Force. He was methodical, analytical, and fearless. To him, a machine was only as dangerous as the man who misunderstood it. When others mocked the American plane, he saw balance. When they complained of vibration, he felt potential energy. He ran his fingers over the propeller spinner, studying the geometry like an engineer inspecting his own design. He didn't say much that day, just one quiet sentence that his crew would later remember. Every machine has a soul. You just have to speak its language. No one could have known that those words marked the beginning of a transformation that would shake the Luftwaffe to its core. As the sun set over the airfield that evening, the Airacobra's olive-green paint glowed like burnished bronze. Its nose cannon pointed east, toward the front lines, where the fate of nations was being decided. The same aircraft that America had rejected was about to find its true calling. And the man who would unleash its hidden strength was already strapping in. The first Airacobra touched down on Soviet soil under a bruised October sky. The airfield near Grozny was little more than a scar of dirt carved between scorched wheat fields and broken hangars. Mechanics rushed forward, boots sinking in the mud, as the aircraft taxied in, its tricycle landing gear wobbling awkwardly on uneven ground. The engine coughed, sputtered, and died with a rattle that drew a few laughs from the ground crew. "American toy," one of them muttered. But Major Alexander Pokryshkin wasn't laughing. He walked slowly around the plane, eyes studying every curve, every seam. The others saw a foreign contraption. He saw symmetry, potential, and balance. That night, as the men huddled in their barracks listening to artillery thunder in the distance, Pokryshkin stayed outside. He sat beneath the wing of the Airacobra, sketching diagrams in the dirt with a wrench. Every pilot in his unit feared the plane's reputation. They had heard about its terrible high-altitude performance and its habit of shaking itself apart. But Pokryshkin wasn't planning to fight at high altitude. He knew the Eastern Front was a different kind of war. Here, the battles raged low, sometimes barely 100 meters above the ground. He turned his eyes toward the horizon where the flashes of German artillery lit the clouds. "That's where this machine will live," he whispered to himself. The first flight came at dawn. Frost clung to the wings, and the engine coughed like an old tractor before roaring to life. Mechanics stepped back as the Airacobra shuddered forward. The noise was unlike anything they'd heard before, deep, mechanical, and throaty. When the aircraft lifted off, the sunlight flashed across its spinner like a blade being drawn. For a few seconds, it flew smooth. Then the shaking began. The vibrations grew worse, rattling the instruments and blurring the horizon. Pokryshkin's teeth clenched, his hands gripping the stick as the aircraft threatened to spiral. But he held it steady, throttled back, and leveled out at low altitude. The tremors softened. The plane stabilized. Below 10,000 feet, the Airacobra became something else, responsive, quick, deadly. He dropped back toward the field, landing with such precision that even the skeptical ground crew fell silent. He climbed out, sweat freezing on his face, and said only, "It flies where it must." That afternoon, he took it into combat. Near Mozdok, the sky was filled with smoke and dust as Soviet ground troops tried to repel a German advance. The Luftwaffe ruled the air. Bf-109s swooped down like hawks, strafing convoys and cutting off supply routes. Pokryshkin spotted them from a distance, 3 silver dots glinting against the sun. He pushed the throttle forward. The Airacobra surged ahead, its Allison engine screaming in protest. He flew low, skimming the treetops, waiting for the Germans to dive. As the first Messerschmitt came down, guns blazing, Pokryshkin pulled into a tight roll, banking underneath it. The 37mm cannon fired once, a sound like a door slamming in the sky. The shell hit squarely in the belly of the enemy aircraft. A flash, a trail of smoke, and then nothing but falling metal. The Soviet ground units below looked up in disbelief. The worst fighter had just brought down one of the Luftwaffe's best. Word spread quickly through the regiment. Pokryshkin's name traveled from one airfield to another. Pilots began to ask for Airacobras instead of avoiding them. He trained them himself, teaching his squadron to use the aircraft's strengths instead of fighting its flaws. "Never climb with the enemy," he told them. "Stay low, strike fast, and vanish." He called it the formula for air combat. And it worked. In the following weeks, Pokryshkin and his men tore through German formations, hitting supply lines and escorting bombers at low altitude where their planes thrived. The Luftwaffe pilots, expecting easy kills, found themselves ambushed by Soviets who seemed to appear from nowhere. By December 1942, the transformation was undeniable. The Airacobra, once America's failure, had become the Soviets' secret advantage. Pokryshkin's squadron began marking kill tallies on their fuselages, the red stars multiplying with every mission. But war has a way of turning triumph into burden. Late that winter, a German intelligence report reached Soviet command. Inside was a chilling entry, written in cold military script. The pilot with the American fighter must be eliminated at all costs. Berlin had identified Pokryshkin. The Luftwaffe had placed a bounty on his head. German pilots began to whisper over radio frequencies, "Achtung, Pokryshkin ist here." When his squadron appeared, enemy formations scattered. To face him was to gamble with death. Pokryshkin's response was simple: he flew more. Every sortie brought new danger. Sometimes his aircraft returned with bullet holes through the fuselage, oil leaking down the sides. Once, a German round struck the propeller hub, and the vibration was so violent the engine nearly tore itself free. But he kept flying, patching the machine overnight, returning to the sky at dawn. His mechanics called the Airacobra the Beast. He called it the Teacher. The Soviets began to realize something deeper, that this unwanted American plane was shaping not just battles, but doctrine itself. It forced them to change the way they fought. Instead of chasing altitude duels, they embraced low-level warfare, diving ambushes, and lightning-fast hit-and-run tactics. By spring 1943, Pokryshkin's regiment was one of the most feared units on the Eastern Front. The Battle of Kuban would cement that reputation forever. The Kuban Air War was chaos, a swirling mass of hundreds of aircraft locked in daily dogfights above the Black Sea. For weeks, the skies burned with contrails and tracer fire. Pokryshkin led his squadron in wave after wave of attacks, turning the P-39 into a weapon of precision. During one mission, he climbed through the morning haze and spotted a formation of German Ju-88 bombers heading towards Soviet positions. He dove from behind the clouds, closing in fast. At 400 meters, he fired a single burst. The 37mm cannon roared, and one bomber disintegrated midair. He shifted, fired again. Another exploded. Within seconds, the formation scattered. The Soviets below cheered as flaming wrecks fell from the sky. That day, Pokryshkin recorded 5 kills in a single mission. His fame spread beyond the Soviet Union. American officers reviewing intelligence reports couldn't believe what they read. The same fighter their own pilots had condemned as unfit for combat was now destroying Germany's finest aircraft over the Eastern Front. But success brought new enemies. Some Soviet commanders, envious of Pokryshkin's growing fame, began to question his methods. They accused him of reckless flying, of improvising beyond orders. He was temporarily grounded, a punishment meant to humble him. He spent those days walking the flight line, watching others take off in the machines he had mastered. Every takeoff reminded him of the war he wasn't fighting. Then one night, he found his old Airacobra parked at the edge of the field. The mechanics had kept it ready, just in case. The next morning, before dawn, he climbed back into the cockpit without authorization. The engine roared to life, breaking the silence. When the control tower demanded an explanation, he simply said, "I'm going to war." He took off into a rising sun, the light glinting off the wings like fire. That mission would become one of his most legendary. Over the front lines, he engaged 4 German fighters alone. His Airacobra dove, twisted, and struck with surgical precision. When he landed hours later, his fuel tanks were dry, but 3 of the enemy planes were burning in the snow. That defiance earned him something rare in wartime: forgiveness. Commanders reinstated him, and within weeks, he was promoted to squadron leader. His tactics became standard doctrine for Soviet fighter units. But Pokryshkin didn't fight for rank or recognition. Each time he climbed into the cockpit, he carried the weight of every pilot who had died believing the Airacobra was a coffin. He was determined to prove them wrong. As 1943 turned to summer, the Battle of Kursk loomed, the largest armored clash in human history. The Luftwaffe prepared to unleash its best squadrons to clear the skies. The Soviets prepared to meet them. And leading the charge was a man flying the plane America had thrown away. He would turn it into a nightmare the enemy could never forget. The morning sun rose over the vast plains of Kursk, lighting a horizon already trembling with the thunder of tanks. Below, thousands of Soviet soldiers braced for the storm. Above them, the Luftwaffe assembled its deadliest squadrons, Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs, sleek and confident, circling like vultures. The air battle for control of the Eastern Front had begun. At the edge of a dusty airfield, Major Alexander Pokryshkin climbed into his Airacobra. The olive paint was scarred from months of combat, patched with bullet holes and soot. His ground crew stood in silence. They had seen this ritual before, the calm before the chaos. Pokryshkin touched the instrument panel once, as if greeting an old friend. The engine behind him growled to life, vibrating the cockpit with that familiar deep tremor. He didn't flinch. He had learned to feel its rhythm, to trust it. The so-called flying Coffin had become his partner in survival. He rolled onto the runway, accelerating through a haze of dust. Within seconds, the earth fell away beneath him. The sky filled with smoke trails and glints of sunlight reflecting off wings. German bombers were inbound, escorted by tight formations of fighters. The radio crackled with orders. Pokryshkin said nothing. He knew what he had to do. Diving from 8,000 feet, he aimed directly for the heart of the German formation. The wind screamed past the cockpit, the control stick shuddering as the Airacobra picked up speed. He fired one burst. The 37mm cannon roared, a single explosive round that tore through the lead bomber's fuselage. The aircraft broke apart midair, fire spilling from its wings like falling stars. The formation scattered, and the battle dissolved into chaos. For hours, the sky over Kursk burned. Pokryshkin's regiment dove struck and vanished in the smoke, exactly as he had taught them. The German advantage in altitude meant nothing now. Every dogfight happened in the brutal air below the clouds, where the P-39 thrived. Soviet pilots called it the Viper of the Low Sky. By dusk, the battle was a blur of smoke and debris. Pokryshkin landed with just enough fuel to taxi back to his hangar. His face was streaked with sweat and oil, his uniform torn. The mechanics counted the bullet holes in his plane, 42 in total. He simply said, "She flies better with scars." That day, his regiment claimed over 100 German aircraft destroyed. It was a victory that stunned even Soviet high command. For the first time in the war, the Luftwaffe had failed to achieve air superiority. Their pilots began to speak of a ghost in the clouds, a man flying an American machine that refused to die. But victory carried a shadow. Weeks later, as the Soviets pushed westward, Pokryshkin's Airacobra was hit during a low-altitude engagement. A German 20mm round struck the rear fuselage, tearing through the engine mount. The cockpit filled with smoke. Flames licked the back of his seat. At that height, bailing out was suicide. He cut the throttle, shut off the fuel, and pulled the aircraft into a glide. The burning engine coughed its last breath, and silence filled the cockpit. He touched down in a field just beyond the front line, the landing gear collapsing on impact. The plane skidded across the dirt, throwing up clouds of earth before coming to rest beside a grove of trees. The canopy burst open. Pokryshkin climbed out, coughing, the air around him thick with the smell of oil and scorched metal. Soviet infantry found him minutes later, staring at the wreckage. "It's over," one of them said. But Pokryshkin shook his head. "No," he whispered. "It's only beginning." Within a week, he had another Airacobra, and was back in the sky. His legend grew faster than the enemy could adapt. Pilots across the front began to copy his methods, rewriting their tactics manuals to follow his formula for air combat. His success forced even the Americans to take notice. Intelligence officers in Washington couldn't believe what they were reading. The P-39, the same plane their own pilots had abandoned, was now one of the deadliest fighters in the war. By 1944, Soviet units requested Airacobras by name, refusing newer aircraft until they arrived. Pokryshkin's squadron alone flew over 600 sorties in these machines, achieving kill ratios that rivaled any Allied unit. When victory finally came in 1945, Pokryshkin stood beside his plane for the last time. Its paint was chipped, its cannon barrel scorched, its propeller edges worn smooth. He rested a hand on the fuselage and smiled faintly. "We showed them," he said quietly. "We showed them all." Epilogue: Buffalo, New York, 1946. The war was over. The Bell aircraft plant in Buffalo was quiet now, the assembly lines dismantled, the machines covered in dust. A single factory worker, one of the few who had been there since 1942, walked through the empty hangar. He remembered the long nights, the noise, the frustration of building planes everyone called useless. He paused beside an old sign still hanging from the rafters. Bell Aircraft, Victory Through Innovation. He wondered if those planes had ever done any good. Thousands of miles away, in Moscow, a letter arrived at the American embassy. It contained a short note written in neat, deliberate handwriting. It read, "To the engineers of Bell Aircraft, from the pilots of the Soviet Union, your machine taught us victory. A. Pokryshkin." No one knows exactly how that message reached them. But when it did, the engineers read it in silence. The same men who had once been told they built America's worst fighter now realized they had built something far greater. Years later, when American designers began developing the first jet fighters, they studied the old Airacobra's blueprints. Its tricycle landing gear, its nose-mounted cannon, and even its mid-engine balance, all once considered design flaws, became guiding principles for the jet age. The flying Coffin had, in its own strange way, paved the road to the future. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The plane that had nearly been scrapped ended up influencing the design of the P-80 Shooting Star and later the F-86 Sabre, the aircraft that would dominate the skies of Korea. In the end, the P-39 was more than a machine. It was a lesson carved in metal and fire. It proved that success is not always born from perfection, but from persistence, adaptation, and the courage to look again at what others have thrown away. Alexander Pokryshkin would finish the war with 59 confirmed victories, all achieved in American-built fighters. He became one of the most decorated pilots in history, awarded the title Hero of the Soviet Union 3 times. To this day, his name remains a symbol of mastery and innovation, a man who saw potential where others saw failure. And somewhere, in a museum hangar far from the battlefield, an old Airacobra sits silent beneath dim lights. Visitors walk past, reading a small plaque that calls it a controversial fighter, rejected by the West, perfected by the East. But if you look closely, just beneath the cockpit, you'll see faint scratches in the paint, names and tallies almost erased by time. They tell the story of the pilot who turned humiliation into triumph, and a machine that went from shame to legend. The wind outside the hangar still hums softly through the propeller blades, almost as if the old engine remembers the sound of battle. Maybe somewhere in that quiet, you can still hear it, the heartbeat of a war, the whisper of a machine that refused to die, and the echo of a man who proved that even the worst fighter can become the deadliest nightmare. If stories like this remind you how courage, ingenuity, and second chances can change the course of history, take a moment to be part of our journey. Please share this video with someone who loves World War II history. Hit that like button to keep it alive, and comment below where you're watching from. We read every single one, from London to Manila, from Texas to Tokyo. And if you haven't yet, make sure to subscribe to WW2 Frontline Legends, because there are still more untold stories waiting just beyond the smoke and steel of history. Stay tuned, because the next legend is already in the SK. Why?